Boa tarde. Então, dando continuidade ao evento, vamos começar essa mesa com duas convidadas da África. Queria chamar, então, Joan Metelerkamp, da África do Sul, e eu vou fazer uma pequena apresentação. Ela vive numa pequena fazenda familiar nos arredores de Konishna e é professora do programa de mestrado em escrita criativa na Universidade de Rhodes. A sua obra consta em várias antologias publicadas em seu próprio país, como em antologias internacionais de literatura sul-africana. Durante alguns anos foi a editora do jornal de poesia New Coin, tendo também sido crítica de poesia e escrito vários ensaios. Participa de diversos festivais de literatura e está preparando a edição do seu 8º livro de poesia. O 8º livro já foi publicado e é esse aqui, né? Now the World Takes This Breath. Queria apresentar também T.J. Dema, residente em Botsuana, que faz performances vocais. Ela é membro da Academia de Escrita da Universidade de Iowa e participou em vários grupos literários nos Estados Unidos, na Inglaterra, na Dinamarca, na Índia, na França e outros países. Ela fez a sua própria antologia, né? Ela editou a sua própria antologia de contos e poemas e fez uma gravação em CD de 12 poetas do seu país, né? Da Botsuana. Enfim, uma breve apresentação e eu gostaria de passar palavras a elas que falassem um pouco, né, sobre o trabalho de cada uma e também elas irão falar algum dos seus poemas.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Is this right?
Okay.
Do you want this one? I'd actually rather stand. Yeah.
Hello? Oh. Yeah.
Is that fine? Okay. I'm going to simply stand and read my poem. Is that all right?
Okay.
Okay. This will give an idea of what I'm doing here. Points on poems. Yeah? Okay. You can begin at any point. 2, you might be asked to account for yourself. You are always asking yourself to account for yourself. You could start with the point that poems don't sell, take stock of that fact, prevaricate, equivocate. 3, leave it as a starting point for later. Balance, interest, currency, the market. 4, you could come back to it before you had begun. You could cycle round lugubriously. Alternatively, 5, get on your bike and ride like hell, like we used to, my brothers and I, when we were kids, careening round the concave concrete cowshed yard, no brakes, no gears, sweaty and queasy and sometimes skidding on bullshit. 6, go with its elliptical spin, which is also weirdly comforting because, 7, a poem has no point. 8, you could begin again. There is not one point to a poem. It is always another point of departure. 9, try another point of departure. Say, poems are like music, not music, but like. The lines Climax, silence, sound, their own melodies, yes, but visions, a score of complex moments in process, emotion almost beyond words, most of all, what you can hardly say, hardly bear to see, and then 10, revision. Revision, if you must. 11, now you see it, now you don't. 12, okay, no ideas but in things, but the thing is, 13, always the poem. 14, not a record, a resonance. 15, but at what point do I come in, you could say, and I could say either through your eye, through your ear, or what my mother used to say, to thin air, when someone in another car hadn't thanked her for letting them in. 16, not at all. Either you get it or you don't. 17, you could ask who speaks when the speaker is I. 18, the point is whose voice out of the blue into thin air uses I, like a child shrieking me, or otherwise playing quietly outside under the pines, whispering you, he, she. 19, yours, mine. 20, the point is, a poem is not a confession. It's not a profession. You could go back to the starting point. Why you do it, it's a puzzle. 21, you could start at the edges or go for the gold in the middle, the bits when you can't tell the reflection from the craft, floating on the surface, a coracle, and the more you piece together the figure, like the Lady of Shalott, drifting through the reeds alone, the more she looks like your daughter or you when you were younger. Only where is the river running, you begin to wonder, and anyway, there's always a bit missing, and we all know it doesn't really help, the picture on the box. 22, you're always figuring out what isn't fixed, even if you think it is, or it is, but still, precisely still. 23, even though my brother when we were older, though according to the song I'm so much younger than that now, and I was already a mother, used to say, don't fix it unless it's broken. 24, this is an old story, like Keats's figures on the jar, still chasing what they want to become, happy, but everything empty, the vessel, the town, they'll never be more than they are. 25, a poem is like live drawing, the essential figure moving. How do you get it moving, 26, across the page? There should be no limit to the number of pages. 27, it has nothing to do with linear narrative, even though it's made of lines, and although it's really a story. 28, where to begin? What is the point of entry? 29, the song of the fertility doll, phallic and female, the energy that's divine, golden girl playing the piano, easy, jazzy, smiling, explaining her hands are two Russian dolls. They do exactly what she tells them to. 30, what on earth am I talking about? Cling, cohere, persevere. 31, don't ask unless you think it's somehow answerable or unavoidable. 32, like voices. 33, St. Joan believed even when she couldn't hear the voices any longer. 34, to the point of burning alive. 35, what do the voices say? What do you feel? Can you make them come? 36, like someone else's voice, another poet's. These poems are usually the best, as though someone else's words came into your head when you wake, like after the recurring dream of intruders. You're sweating that fear of death sweat. You've spent all this time worrying at that point, you know, Eliot made 60 years ago, the still point of the turning world. 37, and he was only rewriting the ancients. And 38, who gives you the right to write what you like anyway? Who's to say if it makes any sense? Anyone. Anyway, all poems are illegitimate. 39, get used to this. You can't do anything else. Language itself is the transgressor. We know this. This is as old as Prometheus. Yes, but what does this mean? Nothing to do with what those who know better call your personal life. 40. Who do you think you're talking to in that tone of voice, like get a life? 41. You, me, myself. A poet is always talking to herself, even more than to the dead. Answering back. 42. If the poem makes its own meaning, makes it up as it goes along, I could come back to this, is something, what thing, the thing the poem is, prior to the poem, need the question arise? It does arise. Like a god rises, you can't not feel this through the slit through the curtains, white light of the night, turning to day, like a lover turning over, through that parting, that opening, that deep coming, leaving only your need to speak. 44. Then instead of moving through the cool passages of an imagined labyrinth, instead you get your head tangled, line after line, like a spider in a spider's web. Arachne still weaving that stuff out of herself, battered over the head with her own distaff by the jealous goddess. Rather be Ariadne, lending her golden thread to her hero to find his way out of the labyrinth. Yes, he abandons her, but who finds her in the end? The one who comes back, Dionysus. 45. What labyrinth? When the crystals are dislodged, the diamond body falls. You feel as though you might fall over yourself every time you reach upwards, even if it's to hang out the washing. If you think I'm talking about the inner ear, I am. 46. If you are too sentimental or conventional for your crystals ever to be knocked out of place, the poems you prefer will be sentimental and conventional, probably in tight little rooms. Room equals stanza in Italian, no doubt someone will explain, with a witty bit left hanging which could be anyone's do not disturb sign. You never know what's going on in there. Of course, there are little rooms where when is a jar not a jar, but a door left just off its jam, opening something we didn't know we could imagine. 47, if you lose your balance completely, no one will want to follow you there. 48, sixth and lastly, as the dog's body policeman says, much ado about nothing. The main point about poetry, 49, you don't find it in airports or book clubs. And if Nadine Gordimer were to ask you if she could publish your work for some cause like AIDS, or even with no cause, with no payment to you at all, you'd say, here, have it all, please. 50, cold comfort. The so-called helpers at the bookshop in Plettenberg Bay have never heard of Nadine Gordimer. So how do you make a living, poet? I ask myself. Not for nothing. 51, there are more ways of silencing a poet than with a sentence. 52, this has nothing to do with the people's poet. 53, this has nothing to do with the woman poet. 54, the point is, nice girls always lie. To protect the innocent, there is a point beyond which they do not think what their good friends might think. 55, if it's only amusement, play, taking yourself seriously, amusing yourself seriously, see what keeps coming up. Like say you keep coming up with an old symbol, the Dionysian heart in a basket. How do you say it? The heart's thought, what does it mean? The eternal return, like the baby's heart on the monitor, your own arrhythmia, heart in your head on the bed, not the apotheosis, but the pattern, the poet said. 57, but the pattern always appears when you're doing something else, following some other thread. You aren't listening or looking, you're driving towards something else, like driving in the heat of the day up Cater's Neck to fetch your teenage son after school, head cruising anyway into the road's rhythm, the heat, windows wide, words gone anyway, like affirmation of the affirmation. And you know this has very little to do with positive thinking. In fact, you're beginning to think it's the opposite. The words return, and there's no way to pull off the road, pull out of its rhythm, to look, listen, to make them some pattern, some sound to hear clearly, not like love, not like this, but I've lost it again, like this, not something like love, not like anything but this. 58. Or you wake in the night to the hot still after a storm, one of the two black southeastern warning storms of the season, mud smell of water receding, frogs down below in the flay. Listen, an old propeller, an old engine, an old crock car, and you don't mind anymore when you're spinning in any old world, nor that the song the frogs make makes no more sense than this. The ballad the wind sings through the reeds, through the house on a hot afternoon, sad, repetitive, like to a baby in the bulrushes, the heart in a basket. The scales you can hear clearly of what the poet calls marvelous, out of sight, below surface, like a mole rat shaking the roots of a khaki bos, and all you can see is the thin plant shaking. Okay, take it, it's just a weed. 59. Below surface, the words of the dead, dreams too. I'll make one point. A poet can't live in daylight too long. The chainsaw in the valley, the chain song of canaries, cisticolas, somber bulbuls, sunbirds, despite the cloud cover, the script of named fynbos, the clear horizon, the still sea, the discomfort of days' plans, narratives. 60. Wake to a snippet of dream recalled. I'm off to get my own handcuffs, my own truncheon. Hurry up, they're waiting for me on the other side of the street. Like opposite the parking lot, they blew up in Pretoria. And I am young again as I was when I lived in Pretoria. 61. Not what he said in the dream, what he felt. Felt what I felt. I was dreaming. I felt his coming in. I think he said something. I felt I was coming in like through a door, through my body. I felt his cock. I took it, held it to my breathing. I am alive so loudly I am grunting in. I am aware even in the dream of my breathing. His speaking, saying, take it in. 62. I suppose I may have invented him. I may have been given him. I didn't choose the metaphor. It chose me, came to me, like a voice, like given words, open a message, open at this passage. The activity of perception or sensation in Greek is aesthesis, which means at root taking in and breathing in, a gasp, that primary aesthetic response. 63. Only it didn't feel like a message, but a man, like a poem, not like love, but love. 64. There is only one point. Begin again, make a poem of it.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
Depois a gente terá a oportunidade de conversar, né, sobre o seu poema. Então passo para TJ, Dema.
It's a strange process working in two languages, especially if you don't speak one of them. Can I just make sure that everybody in the room is either bilingual or has one of these just before we begin? Everyone is good? Okay, fantastic. If you aren't, just by the opening, you'll be able to pick one up on the way in. The way that I've decided to approach this is to spend quite a bit of time talking about the poetry or the poetries coming out of Botswana. I think you can hear me read a poem at the end or online, but I just wanted to kind of engage more in the kind of talk that would maybe lead to a respectful conversation about our different poetries. And so I prepared a little something. No Nation Now But the Imagination, a case of Botswana's poetries. And I should perhaps preface this talk with a bit of a glossary, just in case these words crop up. A citizen of the country of Botswana is called a Motswana. The plural is Batswana. The language and references to culture are Setswana. So for example, one would say, I speak Setswana, or I like Setswana food. Additionally, Setswana has no indigenous script or alphabet. As a result, we use the classic Latin or the Roman alphabet, which was introduced to the country by the British. And of the 26 alphabets, we have no use for the letters C, V, Q, X, and Z or Z. I'm not sure what you call it here. Except perhaps to pronounce words like Brazil when we encounter them, which are obviously not native to our language. Then it suddenly becomes very useful to have that one alphabet. In the Setswana language, the word moki means poet. It has no qualifier. We do not say a performance poet or a spoken word poet or a page poet. We expect all poets to be able to recite their work either from memory or to be able to comfortably read it. So when someone encounters a poet and you introduce yourself as a poet, they do not say, can I read your work? They say mpoke, which literally translates to poem me. So can I hear you? Can you recite a poem about me? Or can you say a poem? This afternoon's talk takes its title, No Nation But the Imagination, from a Derek Walcott poem. He's a St. Lucian poet. And the poem is The Schooner Flight, just in case you want to look it up later. And this talk seeks not so much to answer any questions, because I'm least placed to do that, but mainly to provide a context, as I said earlier, within which Botswana's poetries have and are flourishing or otherwise. I will speak mainly to my experience as a modern poet in Botswana, and I'm aware that in the time given to us, we cannot in one sitting sit through a full and proper discussion on either one of our country's poetries, but I will aim to touch on why we write poetry in the languages that we do, how technology has impacted the dissemination, influences to, and the reach of our poetries to the rest of the world. I point a tentative finger at the differences in the Setswana poetry, which is oral, and the contemporary poetry written in Setswana, as well as what we will call, for the purposes of this conversation, spoken word, which is contemporary and unpublished poems that are specifically written in English. As one University of Botswana lecturer said to me just before I came here, he said, and I suspect he was encouraging me not to mislead the masses once I got to Brazil, but he said that the corpus or the body of literature of Botswana may be fledgling, but it is by no means paltry. If Botswana assume our literary borders to be definite and to be non-negotiable and fixed, then we will suffocate any current or future efforts to write and to recite our work and to be heard. Because there may be 200 million Brazilians, but as far as we know, there are only 2 million in Botswana. Therefore, if we speak of a possible local poetry market in Botswana, and I know that we often think this is the language of business, but we write the books because we hope that they will reach an audience, and therefore market and business is now a part of the conversation about art. This leaves us with a very small target market. And of course, not all 2 million people are able to read or will be willing and able to engage with our poetries. And therefore, our creativity, our imagination, our different ways of sharing our poetry must become the boats, the vehicles through which our words travel to reach out to the rest of the world. We are having this conversation on a few premises that I have chosen to assume that you and I share. One, that Africa is not a country. It is a continent and by definition is linguistically and culturally diverse. Therefore, I cannot speak for an entire continent and its 1.1 billion residents. That would be quite a magnificent feat, and I am not well placed to do so. Also because literary production out of Africa is often categorized by post-colonial geographical and linguistic borders. Although we are, as Botswana, near Mozambique and Angola, because they speak primarily and write primarily in Portuguese, and the rest of the region primarily in English, outside of academia, very few practicing poets are aware on any level of poetry coming out of Africa in Portuguese. Two, not all African writers are social scientists or political commentators. I often sit on panels and the questions very quickly become political instead of speaking about my own poetry, which, because the personal is very political, is of course subtly political. My politics is under the radar, but the point is not the point. And yet often the conversations move into this political sphere because there is this belief that if you are an African poet, you must tackle all the great themes of death and poverty and war, as though we do not make love, as though we do not attend weddings, as though nothing happens in between these wars. Three, I have assumed that literature, specifically poetry, in this room today must encompass not only all published text that names itself as poetry, but also what is live, what is oral, and what is spoken or staged. Otherwise, I will mislead you into thinking that there is no poetry coming out of Botswana when that is not actually the case. That there are things that unite us amongst people of the same ethnic or regional or perhaps continental placement is not surprising. But to discount that there are just as many, if not more, differences and individual interests between human beings would be folly. If you read an anthology on African poetry, and it has 10 or so, say, West African or East African poets, and one South African and one Zimbabwean poet, I would invite you to read conscientiously between the lines in terms of how legitimate a definition that is when that body of work is referred as something that is reflective of the entire continent. But of course, modern Setswana poetry is complicated or made richer or simply influenced or impacted by the modern poets' access to various world literatures through libraries and television and the internet. To assume a fixed, homogeneous cultural formation is inherently problematic. Culture is dynamic, and one would argue that creative human beings' thoughts and expressions are possibly more so. Botswana poets write on a number of diverse themes. That we have, since independence from Britain in 1966, had transparent and free democratic elections and never had a war or suffered explicitly violently under colonial rule has, generally speaking, shaped Botswana poets and their poetry differently from, say, certain South African literature, which has had a specific cause to rally itself around, to use poetry as a tool for change, as a way, for example, to respond to and actively speak against apartheid. I should mention that we have in Botswana, I believe not unlike Brazil, recently had our national elections. And even though I will not veer into politics, except to say that these were for us the first elections to clearly divide us along geographical and class lines. And everyone became an overnight poet, albeit their form was one of rants expressed on Facebook and social media. And I am excited to see how both these overnight poets and the regular practicing poets will respond, if they choose to either the elections themselves or to whatever circumstance invited such strong participation from the everyday man. In terms of the role of technology, there are more cultural exchanges that have begun to happen slowly between Botswana and the rest of the world. Prior to this, many scholars studied literature and languages at undergraduate and graduate levels, and they began to share their international influences, who they were reading in the classroom, and so on and so forth. But now access to the internet has had a palpable effect on, I guess, perhaps the last two generations of writers, arguably aged anywhere between 15 and 50. They watch YouTube videos, they read online journals and blogs, they travel, they watch international poetry events, including slams, and for some of them, their influences are rooted for the first time externally, rather than in poets that they have met or know in Botswana. Setswana poetry, the oral poetry, as by virtue of that definition, is rather listened to in person than read from any published text. The traditional oral poets were, to our knowledge, exclusively male. There were no women who were poets. All the storytellers were women who told stories to children, and then the poets who got to address a much larger and much more adult audience were all men. The traditional Setswana poets are not at all concerned with form. They do not care what a poem looks like on the page, because as far as they're concerned, it will never be written down and it will never be seen. So they are much more concerned with oratorical cadence, the sound of the poem, as opposed to the instructions that a page poet would have to build into the form of the poem, so that when it is being read outside of their presence, it can be understood in the voice that they meant it. They did not, and there are those who still do not write their poems. These are the poets who write in Setswana. They either compose the poems in the moment. They walk into a room such as this and begin to talk about your hair and your t-shirt and your bag and the situation. Or they would compose prior to the event, but even then they would not write the poems down. They compose and memorize them simultaneously and then share them at a later date. They measure their poems, as one would argue, in units of breath, and each poem becomes a collaboration, because when it is shared with an audience, the audience is expected to respond. Because it has no form, there are no defined stanzas, but the audience is expected to respond either through clapping or shouting or specifically ululation. Is this something that's understood in Brazil, ululation? I cannot make the sound, perhaps. No. Yes, like a lulu, and I cannot. But you would make that sound if you thought there was a line in the poem that was particularly strong, or a phrase that moved you. But when you do that, the poet slows down or stops completely. And therefore, a member of the audience or members of the audience have, in essence, created a stanza in the poem that was previously not there. And so all poems were an act of collaboration. Feedback was also instantaneous, and you basically never had to wait for a book review. You knew upon sharing the poem whether this was working or not working. Common traditional themes were rain and tribal totems, cattle, which are a huge part of our culture to this day, warriors or exemplary human beings within the tribe, as well as traditional medicine or bone-throwing poems. If you want to see a traditional doctor or a shaman or whatever the international equivalent is. Contemporary Setswana poets do, however, write down and publish some of their poetry. And therefore, as a consequence, even though they write in Setswana, of course they edit more and they think more about stanza and meter and the shape of the poem on the page. Bili Mokhosi, one of our scholars who concerns himself with poetry in Botswana, in his book, Poko Jalele Jana, which loosely translates to Poetry Then and Now, suggests that contemporary poetry, though still in Setswana, no longer uses as much symbolism and metaphor as before. He goes further to insist that even the language used is no longer high or formal Setswana, but a lighter, watered-down version of the language, and that often it is difficult to identify the difference between conversational and poetic language. Contemporary poets write about anything they want. They do not restrict themselves to the traditional, communally meaningful themes that I mentioned earlier. There's a phase in the late 1990s that we went through where a collective of young poets, myself included, I was young then, rose up in the capital city of Gaborone. Not unlike the traditional oral poets, these spoken word poets were preoccupied with sound over text. The collective gained popularity, and at its peak, it would host monthly shows in the city of Gaborone, which has a population of about 250,000 to 350,000 people. And the annual festival that they would host would see 200 to 500 people come into the audience to listen to these unpublished poets share their work. They almost exclusively worked in English. They mostly memorized and read their own work and occasionally collaborated with musicians. It must be pointed out that prior to this collective, which is called the Exodus Live Poetry Collective, there had been readings by older poets, some of them academics from the local university, who met to literally read the work off the page out loud in public spaces. And before then, in the 80s, there is clear mention of a collective called MEDU, M-E-D-U, of artists and poets, some of them South Africans, such as Mongane Sorote, Baleka Mbete, and Keorapetse Khositsile, who is the current South African poet laureate. And they were either South Africans in exile or in transit or visiting Botswana at the time. So they contributed in a very specific manner to the development of poetry in Botswana. By the year 2010, there were more and more collectives or open mic nights being hosted in and around the city by various groups. Partly because of the popularity of poetry in its spoken form, there have been radio shows with a poetry focus or slots on a show about something else where poets are featured. Recently, a national radio station traveled all the way across the country to broadcast a poetry workshop that I was co-facilitating because they felt that there was justification in terms of their audience. Poetry is popular in Botswana. It has been for a long time. It is recited at just about every wedding, in cafes, in classrooms, occasionally at funerals, and is commissioned for government conferences and meetings and for private sector corporate events. Whenever they're launching something, they would invite a poet to be present. So they would have a man of the cloth say a prayer and then a poet, and that would take care of the official bit, and then everybody else could come in. It's not surprising that because of this visibility of poets, one or two non-poetry related magazines have used poets instead of normal celebrities on the covers of their magazines. Is this useful for poets who wish to seek out publicity or festival bookings? Of course, it's exposure. Does it impact their writing either negatively or positively to get this kind of celebrity status? It's not my place to say. When it comes to books, we're slowly moving towards publishing our poetry and allowing the reader or the listener, in the case of audio recordings, to engage with our poetry. We have to begin to think more about our own poetics and its place within the West's, or rather the world's, idea of what a good poem is, about what the poem looks like on the page, what language our poems speak in, whether we use our poetry purely to entertain, to delight, to preserve culture, to praise, or whether it serves an educational purpose, and whether this has to be a choice of one or the other, or whether this can happen in tandem. In 2006, the Exodus Live Poetry Collective that I mentioned earlier produced a DVD of a festival that they hosted, and it was sold to individuals, but it was also aired on national television. In 2012, an organization that I run called Sauti ANPM recorded 12 poets, this was mentioned earlier, on one CD. They mainly recited their work in English, but we made sure that we had a number of poets on here who were speaking in other languages. So there could be at least, that was not the intention, but token representation of the bigger space. In addition, thanks to free online platforms such as SoundCloud and YouTube, as well as access to technology, including through high-functioning mobile phones, because there are, to my recollection, twice as many cell phones within Botswana's borders as there are human beings. And so if you are trying to reach people, this is definitely a medium that you have to consider. This is the way to get to young Botswana is through their phones. There are various books and dissertations at undergraduate and graduate level dealing with the work of some local poets, including Barolong Seboni, who is one of the most recognized poets that we have in Botswana, as well as the late Ikalanga poet. So Ikalanga, I didn't mention this earlier, is the Kalanga are my tribe. So we are from within Botswana's borders, but Setswana is not our first language. And so this was one of our poets who wrote his entire body of work in Kalanga, and not in English and not in Setswana. As one delves into the history of Botswana's poetry, it becomes clear that it has not always been easy to separate Setswana poetry and music. What might be considered lyrical poetry is a large part of Botswana's poetic history, and one would serve themselves well to look up names such as Ratsie Setlhako, Ndina Poifo, Gautwe Sepe Robalang, Mporeng Malema, Shelling Usitilwe, Speech Madimabe, and others, in order to engage relevant scholars about where the line in Botswana is drawn between lyrical poetry and song and music that is performed in the Setswana language. There are lots of other poets who I could name, and I will probably just put their names up on my blog for anyone who's really interested. Because suddenly saying their names out loud in Brazil, I realized how unusual, perhaps, for a non-Botswana speaker, the names might sound. There are a couple of poets who have been published as well. Judge Mazebedi and Rogoff Mudise each put out a collection before they died in their 40s. Cassels Botloko published a couple of collections before he died in his early 30s. Tirosibina is a brilliant poet and an academic and a literary critic of note, which is a useful position for him to occupy because of the size of our community, we are hesitant to critique each other's work. Everybody knows your mother and your brother, or they're dating your sister, so it's kind of complicated to say, I think that was a terrible poem. In fact, it's not a poem at all. So the necessary conversations are not happening, which I believe are an important part of the development of a space and its poetries. We also don't translate anywhere near as much work as we should. And therefore, for those who write in local languages, their reach is for now often limited and rendering them either internationally inaccessible or, for all intents and purposes, invisible. Although basic or introductory poetry is taught in government-aided secondary schools in Setswana and English as a mandatory part of the high school syllabus, post that secondary school exposure, a significant number of practicing Botswana spoken word poets are autodidacts. That is, they are self-taught and have never participated in a structured creative writing program. There are, of course, those who studied externally outside of Botswana's borders, as well as the University of Botswana's English and African language departments. There are no writing residencies anywhere within Botswana's borders. There is no arts council. There is no national lottery to fund arts projects. There is a Ministry of Youth, Sports and Culture, which, in my opinion, has its priorities in exactly that order: youth, then sports, then culture. And they have an average of 3 or 4 calls a year for applicants to submit requests for funding, relatively small funding. In terms of literary bodies and libraries, and if I go on for too long, as it just
It's okay.
cut me off, we have the Reading Association of Botswana, the Writers Association of Botswana, which, although it is 34 years old, to this date still does not have an office and relies on the individual energies and motivations of the executive committees that each serve a 2-year cycle. The Botswana National Library Services were set up in 1968, 2 years after independence. They serve as the legal deposit and copyright library. So if you publish a book as a Motswana, you're meant to submit, I believe it's 2 copies of your book to them. We have recently set up what's called a poetry reading room. There's a very generous and award-winning, wonderful poet named Kwame Dawes, who started a foundation that you would probably be interested in, called the African Poetry Book Fund. And he has just shipped books to somewhere between 4 and 7 different African countries that are all brand new, not secondhand, contemporary books of poetry, a lot of Afro-Caribbean, Black British, as well as poetry from different parts of Africa. And we've received 1 shipment of those books, and for the first time have set up a small little corner reading room in a poetry, in one of the national libraries in the main mall. And so this is one of the ways in which we are trying to encourage the poetries of Botswana. In an interview with Lee Nichols of Voice of America, the Motswana poet R.D. Molefe reads a poem to Nichols that he wrote in 1973 during a visit by the American poet Nikki Giovanni, and in it he says that there are no women poets. Later, in an interview carried out in 1981, Nichols points out that he has just attended the writer's workshop at the University of Botswana, and that there he has heard young women read their poetry. And so this gives us a little bit of a time frame of when women might have started publicly participating in the reading of poetry. I think I will just end there, actually. And if we get any questions, we get questions. Hopefully not. I was trying to cheat the listener out of asking any questions. But thank you for listening.
Obrigada, TJ. Queria passar a palavra para a nossa poeta da África do Sul. E gostaria que você falasse um pouco sobre esse poema, sobre uma espécie de uma história que incitou a feitura, desse poema que você leu aqui para a gente. Poema dos pontos. Okay?
Sorry, not
okay.
quite. No,
Not quite.
no, just can you repeat the question?
Okay.
What that I should...
Eu gostaria que você conversasse com a gente sobre esse poema, os pontos em poema, porque eu imagino que tenha tido alguma questão que incitou a realização desse poema.
Okay, fine. Sorry, I just...
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's very interesting because I used to think that the literary scene in South Africa was completely barren.
Okay.
Yeah. But in fact, listening to TJ, it's the interesting things that are going on in Southern Africa, anyway, in the region. This particular poem was commissioned by this journal, New Coin, which has been going for it celebrates its 50th year of publication this year.
Okay.
Yeah. And the thing about it that is quite interesting is that when I was asked by the editor to write this piece, I was asked for some essay about the state of South African poems. And I found that the essay form was irritating to me at some level. And the more I started to play with it, the more this emerged. And I suppose part of the point of the poem, if you like to call it that, is simply to foreground poetry as opposed to critique or the essay. It's a play on, if you like, it's a play on economic speak, because it's bullet points, point 1, 2, 3. But it's also a play on poem as prophecy, because as we were talking about earlier, it has 64 points which are based on the Chinese Book of Changes, the I Ching, so which is that oracular consultative, whatever, sorry, I can't get the word, piece of ancient literature. And so that's what this was also. Is that enough for the meantime?
Very. Obrigada. Que a gente almoçou juntas, né, aqui, e a gente já tinha conversado várias questões sobre o estereótipo da África, né, como burlar essa identidade, né, fechada que você sempre espera, e nós brasileiros também sofremos disso, né? O Brasil é sempre o sensual, o exótico, o samba. E foi muito interessante a fala da TJ, exatamente nessa direção. E eu gostaria, então, de pedir a ela que falasse alguns dos poemas, né? Fizesse essa prática tão usual na Botsuana, que mistura um cosmopolitismo, né, do slam, talvez do rap, de uma poesia contemporânea, né, da fala, né, ou seja, de uma poesia menos grandiloquente, né, mas uma poesia aqui nessa terra nossa, e numa espécie de ritual performático, né, onde todos participam também. Foi muito interessante ela falar que alguém da plateia interrompe e cria-se uma estrofe, e como que o poema vai sendo feito na medida em que ele é falado, né? Eu não falo aqui recitado, porque essa palavra, para mim, é abominável na poesia contemporânea. Então, eu falo falar, ler, performatizar, né? E outra coisa que eu gostaria de chamar a atenção é a diferença de dicção entre as duas poetas, né? Uma tem uma dicção mais clássica da poesia anglo-americana, né, cheia de ritmos e de pequenas iluminações, né? E a da TJ é mais ligada a essa música contemporânea que a gente sente, assim, uma afirmação, mesmo na fala dela. Por isso que eu estou muito curiosa em escutar ela falar o poema, né? Porque tem uma assertividade, ao mesmo tempo livre, né? Ela é assertiva no domínio da dicção, mas não é autoritária, né? No sentido negativo. Tem uma espécie de liberdade nesse uso da palavra, né? Então, acho que ela vai ler para a gente. Tomara.
I would hate to invite myself to read a poem. I hope that that's what you were leading to.
Yes.
I am tempted to preface this poem, but I won't. I will just say that this is a neon poem, and it was written after hearing Amiri Baraka read his poem Black Art. So this is neon poem. Poems are bullshit unless they teach. Poems serve no purpose unless they reach the audience they are written for, the ears they are meant for. You could write the perfect love poem, tell us how you teased her till she let you touch her, but if she cannot remember you, then, sir, your poetry didn't do what it was supposed to. Because I have heard war poems that hid behind fancy syllables and metaphors, quietly comfortable with the thought of coming to blows over why they should fight for anything at all. And once I wrote a hope poem, one of those there's a future type poems, but it never spoke till what few wishes we had left broke. I've even seen live poems that wait till the audience is gone, then begin humming softly as a song, murdering any sense of rhythm they might have had at all. So I'm thinking of an "It's Too Late" poem. I'll build it up till it sounds like metal bats against tin cans, loud and outrageous still. Too little, too late. Because we want fast poems that can outrace us, outface us, maybe even take us to where we've never been, quick as sin. A "Look at Me" poem that screams out to the world, open up your eyes and see. You can't even speak your mind, yet you still believe that you and we are free from something or someone. Anyone give me a neon poem, a black, red, white, yellow, purple, pink, even lime poem that will teach all other wannabe poems how to grow up and become real type poems, because poems are bullshit unless they teach, and they serve absolutely no purpose unless they reach someone.
Obrigada. Você gostaria de ler outro poema, TJ?
Oh, sure. This is Dreams. Dreams are evil, and I prefer nightmares. They show you what goes on in here reflects what goes on out there. Dreams lie. They lead you down a path where white chocolate flows undammed and mulberries fall unshaken from the trees. Nothing is less faithful, less real, or more untrue than a dream. Ask yourself, does your every waking moment have to be this hard? I, for one, am tired of spending sleepless nights, chasing hesitant tomorrows, biding my time just to spend it mending broken things that have no wish to be fixed. So I will not spin and spin inside the skin. I will not spin and spin inside the skin. I will not mourn a future I never had. I refuse to bleed myself for an almost reality rooted in the distant echoes of a once upon a voice chanting, I know I can, I know I can, because I know I can. Be the girl I am right now. Live the life I have right now. Maybe even choose to be the dream I'm in right now. Maybe then it won't seem so hard just to breathe right now.
Joan, Joan, eu falava da diferença de dicção que eu havia percebido entre vocês duas. O que você poderia falar sobre isso? E também gostaria que você falasse um pouco sobre a questão das línguas na África do Sul, né, desse convívio do inglês e das outras línguas, né, africanas, e como isso aparece no seu trabalho com a língua inglesa, entre aspas.
Well, I'm interested in what you say about the diction, because I myself don't hear that the difference in diction so clearly between me and TJ. So, so that's interesting. What I do, I do think perhaps what this Points in Poems has is perhaps it's playing on different references more than particular diction. So it's, in some senses, although, and again this is a kind of qualifier, although it was written, the time that I've read it, that it's worked best, has been in part of a kind of if you like, not a performance, but where there was an audience who is used to listening to poetry, not reading. Yeah. So, and that happened in Grahamstown with a young audience of mother tongue Xhosa speakers who were there as part of a writing group coming to listen to various people reading. Anyway, so be that as it may, it has worked the best when there's been the kind of audience reception that you're talking about with audience intervention. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that I think that it is, in some senses, it's the context of the actual, of reception which determines one's idea of what the diction is, if you like. I don't think that those kids, in other words, in that particular audience, were fazed by my diction. The other thing that I will just say is that I think that there are many phrases in this poem which echo or which come from Afrikaans, because that's the lingua franca in the area that I live. So even though it was the language of, we were talking about this earlier, the language of the oppressor, the language of Afrikaner nationalism, there's a struggle in that language just as much as there is in English. Because there are a number of people in the Cape who are mother tongue Afrikaans speakers, and it's not divided along racial lines as in the way that it used to be. But the interesting thing is that when this particular poem was translated into French, those phrases were cut out.
Oh.
Yeah. So, anyway, I have an awkward history with the French. We've talked about that. Thank you.
TJ, você gostaria de falar alguma coisa em relação à questão da dicção, da maneira de ler o poema, da sonoridade com a língua? Haveria uma diferença entre você e a Joan, ou eu estou criando uma discussão aqui apenas para escutar mais vocês? Ok?
I will come about this from a different point of view, and then perhaps throw it back to you, as she said, so you can kind of clarify. I think perhaps you're leading towards something or away from something, and maybe we're not quite clear on what it is. But our relationship with language in Botswana is an interesting one, and I don't really know enough about this subject to be, I think, speaking about it on this platform. But just in my opinion and from my observation, often the friction in language, if a people are using a language that they have inherited from whoever was previously in power, and especially not rightly so, there is a tension there that is directly correlated to the nature of the relationship that was had, right? You do not wish to use this language because, quote unquote, it is the language of the oppressor. Although Botswana was a British colony, in our case, they often use the strange terminology, a British protectorate rather than a British colony. And they were not really primarily present physically in the country. They did not leave us with their architecture. They left us with 4 kilometers of road. They thought there was nothing of importance in the country. So our administrative capital was outside our borders. We didn't have a capital within our borders. So it was a kind of tentative, we'll keep an eye on that piece of land because land is important, but we don't really think there's anything important there. And so our relationship has always been kind of one of distance rather than one immediately physically standing over you and lauding their power. So for a lot of my generation, in fact, for a lot of us, English, we simply look at it as a tool. when does it serve us? If we're trying to read text in Spanish that we cannot access in Botswana because it definitely has not been translated into Setswana, what is our middle language? What language can we go through to access? If we want to reach a broader audience, again, which language can we go through that would allow us? So all these conversations about writing through English, not necessarily in it. We are not caught up in its politics, and perhaps they will come one day to find us. Perhaps they've already found us and we're not seeing it. But for us, we are quite literally using English as a tool of convenience, either to hear the other or to be able to be heard by the other.
Obrigada. Eu gostaria, então, se elas estiverem de acordo, de passar a palavra à plateia para perguntas. Ok? Over, Joan? Ok?
Posso? In which language shall I ask a question? Portuguese or English? Que língua pergunto?
Você pode escolher, na verdade, eu acho. Porque haverá tradução, né?
Mas talvez
simultânea.
Em português, porque senão as pessoas têm que
eu
colocar.
acho mais simpático em português.
Sim, mais simpático. Lá vou eu.
Acho...
Uma pergunta para a colega sul-africana é sobre...
Joan.
Como?
Joan.
Sim, eu sei que é Joan. Sobre a política das línguas na África do Sul. Eu estou querendo que ela amplie um pouquinho o que ela já comentou sobre o uso popular do afrikaans, agora que o afrikaans não é mais a língua do Lani, como eu estive na África do Sul algumas vezes, e não é mais a língua do chefe. E o que tem significado o se livrar da ser uma língua imposta para se voltar a uma língua crioula, como ela sempre foi? O que isso tem significado em termos de poesia e música? Eu sei que tem muito rap no Cape Flats, tem muita coisa que vem em afrikaans feito por não brancos. Mas como isso afeta a política das línguas? Porque é uma política, there is a language struggle, tem uma luta de língua na África do Sul. Como isso tem se modificado nos últimos anos, desde que o afrikaans não é mais uma língua tutelada, mas é uma língua livre, que é bom para se contar piada, para se falar de mulher, coisa que em inglês não dá para se contar. Primeira pergunta. Uma pergunta para
TJ.
É sobre o local e o global. Quando escutei você falar de Amir Baraka, que eu conheci como Leroy Jones, antes dele mudar nome, Rhythm and Poetry, senti também no seu estilo de poesia lindérrimo muito do rap, do Rhythm and Poetry. Me pergunto, Amir Baraka foi para Botsuana ou você foi para Amir Baraka? Qual é a relação entre vocês, quais são os circuitos? Porque nós sabemos que os africanos são infinitamente mais cosmopolitas de como nós pensamos. Esse me parece um dos objetivos. Mas pode contar mais um pouco sobre os circuitos, como o rap chegou lá? E gostaria muito que você, se puder, performasse uma poesia em Setswana. Uma seria assim.
You first. Me first. We have come to the point where we have our first potential problem. I do not write, no, in a good way. This is good for discussion. I do not write poetry that has ever been heard publicly in Setswana. I explore it privately. There are lots of poets who write in Setswana. Admittedly, I spoke about reach a little bit earlier, about just how seen or how heard they are outside the country. The poets that tend to travel are the ones who tend to write in English, unless I am organizing the trip, and then I always take one poet who performs in Setswana and wears the traditional garments, and we've included a couple on the CD that I raised earlier. My reasons for not writing in Setswana are a million and require an entirely separate panel with just me talking for 4 hours. But one of the things is that English is the language of academic instruction in Botswana. So from age 3, ever since I've been in a classroom, I've spoken English for anything from 4 to 8 hours a day, right? Depending on whether I had activities after school or not. I only studied Setswana as a subject within my daily subject. So I would spend 40 minutes maybe a day learning Setswana. And I would get home and we would speak 3 different languages. But for my generation, a lot of our parents made the mistake of thinking that you had to trade one language for another, that you couldn't really learn English properly if you also focused on Setswana. So I've heard, which is of course untrue, children have a capacity to acquire, anybody has a capacity to acquire multiple languages. I've heard stories of schools where children were beaten for speaking Setswana because the teachers were saying you have to speak English. This language is the currency. This is what is going to open up the world to you. There's some merit in that, not in the beating of the children, in their thinking, but their approach was completely convoluted and mistaken, and they should have instead been adding more and more languages. But like I said, a conversation for another day. So unfortunately, I will not be reading poetry to you in Setswana today, but you can find it online. And see other poets and see how they dress as well, because they dress traditionally, and there's a whole thing that comes with that. In terms of rap, I don't know. I liked rap for about a year of my life when I was somewhere between 14 and a half and 15 and a half. And I really, really listened to it. And then I just kind of moved on to other things. But I don't know, you're the sum total of your experiences. And also, my duty is sort of to compose the poem as well as I can and then put it out into the world and then expect, if I'm to find any joy, that every reader brings their own references and biases. That even though I might not be doing what the traditional poets did, which was stand in front of an audience and have immediate intervention, I presume that that intervention is still happening in your head. You're still echoing certain lines, you're still remembering your favorite poet and thinking, oh, she sounds like that person, or she sounds like this person. And so I'm honoring your perception of my work, even though I have never particularly described it that way myself. Baraka and I went to each other in the sense that the internet, the world, listening to his master classes, but I also did get to travel to the States before he left us and got to hear him at least once. So it was a little fairer this time. It wasn't just somebody traveling from the UK on a ship to Botswana and running the country. It was much more an exchange this time around, yes. I need to stop now.
Sorry, I'm getting the wrong thing. During the 90s in South Africa, there was quite a development of poetry as an art form. And I'm just giving you some big blanket statements. There is a very nice collection of 20 South African poets in performance, Poetry 99, edited by Robert Berold, who was the person who used to edit this journal, New Coin, in that time. And there's a little introduction written by a Xhosa poet. No, he's not a Xhosa poet. He writes in English, sorry. But his name is Mxolisi Nyezwa. And I'll just read you a little bit in answer to, I hope it helps to clarify your question. For the black poets writing at that time, like Lesego Rampolokeng, Ike Muile, Mzima Hola, Sipiwe Ngwenya, and Sitlamo Mutsapi, and myself, writing was the only way to stay focused on the bigger scheme of things, the onerous struggle to be accepted as human beings in our own country, and later as full citizens with the power to vote. Admittedly, in black writing in South Africa, there's always been a need to enter into deep conversation with the oppressor, often along terms and conditions that the oppressor had determined. That is how black writers entered into all practicalities with the English language and used that language to make the situation of the oppressor untenable. For as black writers, have we not always been the messengers of the word to the white world? Has it not always been a world that is and stone-hearted, intransigent and embittered with and without our presence? I don't know if that helps, but there's a yeah.
Obrigada, Joan. Mais alguma pergunta? Ela quer fazer uma pergunta.
Isso é em português, não é isso?
Em português.
A música, para TJ, a música no Brasil, a canção, toma o lugar da poesia. A grande audiência, o grande público, como vocês duas disseram, não é de poesia. Existem alguns eventos de poesia recitada, mas o grande coisa é a canção popular, é a música. Qual é o lugar, seja o rap, seja da música na poesia, nos dois lugares, tanto em Botsuana quanto em Cabo?
I think it's all one big party, and everybody's invited to the table. I know that with the spoken word poets who started performing in the late 90s, early 2000, somewhere between 2000 and 2003, they're those for whom the two are inseparable. And again, you can find their work online. They always have a guitarist with them on stage. They sometimes have a full band. I myself have played with a 16-piece band, and I have a band with 6 musicians who do what they do, and I talk because I cannot sing, I cannot carry a tune in a bucket, but I just insist on speaking over the music. And even though I prefer to share my poetry unaccompanied, I've really, really enjoyed performances where the two have come together, I think on an equal footing. My thing is just that because I work with a lot of young writers, I encourage them in the beginning, if they think of themselves as poets and not as vocalists or as other interesting descriptors, that they focus on the words, that the content must be the strength of what they're putting on the table, and that the music should not become a crutch. It should become something that works in and outside of and around and with the words. But that the important thing for me, because I'm coming at this collaboration, this meeting from the point of a poet, is that I will not excuse what I perceive to be weak writing, and this should not get me into trouble, in the name of, because it's a combination and because it's cute and because it's novel, right? So I still pull them aside and say, the writing didn't work here, didn't work there. But I don't see it as a competition. And I doubt that poets will ever regularly pack a stadium of 30, 60,000 people the way some popular, musician might. Although I don't know, Medellin, I've heard things about a festival in Colombia that has quite exciting numbers. But again, that's an exception. Or Poetry Parnassus in London, which happened when they had over 200 poets from various Commonwealth countries perform. Then you got large audiences. But again, that's kind of an unusual situation, an exception to the rule rather than something regular and constant.
Eu só queria falar uma coisinha, porque essa é uma questão complicada, né, da canção, da poesia brasileira, que tem uma tradição ligada realmente à canção desde o século XIX, né, Marcelo? Mas como ela vai ganhando uma coloquialidade, né, exatamente para contrariar essa retórica grandiloquente. Então, a gente vê como que relações como Manuel Bandeira e Senhor, Noel Rosa, né, que tem uma... Porque ela mesmo falou da fala, né, como que a poesia não se distingue da conversa, né? Então, ela nunca toma um tom altissonante. Então, nessa tradição de uma música não melódica dentro da poesia brasileira, estou querendo só fazer essa diferença, né? A música não melódica, mas polifônica, de um ritmo mais contrariado e ligado a um coloquial, né? Que tem também na nossa tradição, e que eu só queria pontuar com essa invasão do gospel americano, como está mudando a dicção da música brasileira, né? Grandiloquente, de uma expressividade espiritual, né? A gente vê o The Voice e vê isso. E cadê a nossa dicção? Por isso que eu estava falando muito aqui em dicção, né? E não a dicção que eu falava que eu sentia diferença entre as duas, não é só pelo uso da língua misturada com as línguas locais, né, com as línguas nacionais, mas talvez até pela diferença de idade, desculpe, mas uma outra geração, né? Então, estamos aqui com duas poetas de duas gerações, a Joan e a TJ. Então, a TJ, para mim, ela está mais marcada pelo slam, por essa... não o rap, talvez, mas tem ali um viés dessa assertividade livre que ela tem na dicção, e a Joan é uma poesia mais ligada à tradição mesmo anglo-americana, dessas cintilações de ritmos livres, é um verso livre que ela trabalha, pelo menos essa poesia que ela mostrou aqui, mas cheio de reverberações e de sonoridades que se entrechocam. Tem um trabalho ali muito importante com a língua que a gente percebe dentro da tradição anglo-americana. E a DJ está mais ligada a esses novos procedimentos próximos dessa performatividade do slam, do rap, de novas tecnologias, etc. Essa que seria a minha visão, mas eu não tenho certeza sobre isso. Alguém quer falar? Joan ou TJ? Vocês querem falar sobre isso?
I don't even know how to come at this, but it's always interesting because depending on your vantage point, you will see things one way or another. When I was first starting to share my work, and I remember taking it to poets or lecturers, educators at the University of Botswana, I remember one or two of them saying to me, we don't quite know what to do with this, what to make of this. You're kind of sort of following the rules you like, and then other rules you're completely ignoring them, so we don't quite know how to help you. 5 years later, they were inviting me into the classrooms to speak to their students because they felt like they could almost only have part of the conversation with their students and had no language, if you like, for how to discuss certain things in terms of the writing. But now I'm older, and there's some younger poets who do what I definitely think of as slam. And they recite the poetry really, really fast, and they have 5 minutes, and it's a competition, and then they have a theme that comes from the audience, and then they have to generate the poem in real time, which I cannot do. This is all too fast for me. It probably goes against my private, quiet little secret definitions of what I think, how I think craft and technique work in poetry, simply because I suspect there isn't enough time in that 5 minutes or 3 minutes to really work wholly with the poem. I can do exercises like that when I'm running a workshop because I want people to go away with something they can work on. But to compose something in 2 minutes and share it with an audience is something I find really challenging. And so I almost find myself sometimes saying, no, I'll go and find out who you can go and speak to, but I don't have the language to help you in the way that you need help. So I am now the lecturers from 10 years ago who were telling, but I try at least now to say, go and see Joan. What you need her, it's not me. Yeah, that's my take on that.
Joan, quer falar? You want to talk?
No, I simply want to say, I'm very intrigued to hear all of this myself. There's somebody, Lesego Rampoliking is a poet from South Africa with a particular genius. He is not as old as I am, but he's definitely considerably older than TJ is. I mean, I don't remember how old he is, but might be 10 years younger than me. But the point is that he has been using a form which is a different form from TJ's or mine. It is literary, it is literate, it is at the same time completely performance-oriented. And so it plays with language. It asks to be performed, but it also asks to be read. I don't know if I'm saying anything, but I'm simply, through this conversation, his is the name that has recurred.
Okay.
So.
Thank you. Alguém mais tem alguma pergunta? Se não, vamos encerrar essa mesa. Queria agradecer a presença de vocês e da TJ e Joan por essa bela tarde. Obrigada.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.